lonely rancher ordered a virgin bride, but found a widow with tears and a voice that broke his silence. Spring, 1873. Dusty Creek, Colorado. The valley burned gold beneath the sinking sun. Wind carried the bite of red dust and the resin scent of pine, rattling against weather-worn fences. On the porch of his cabin stood Malcolm Hayes, a tall, broad-shouldered man, his shadow stretched long over cracked earth. For 6 years he had lived like a ghost. A bullet in Abilene had spared his life but stolen his voice. Since that day, silence clung to him like a second skin. He worked still, drove cattle, braced against winter storms. But there was no song, no laughter. Only chalk scratches on a slate nailed by the door, short gestures, the slow nod of a head. Folks said the man had died long ago, leaving only a body that tilled and mended. At times, Malcolm believed them, until the day he sent a letter east to Missouri, to a matchmaker's office. He asked little. A young woman, obedient, unburdened by history. Someone to soften the cabin's shadows, to ease the ache of long nights. He did not ask for love. Such things belong to men unbroken. He sought only quiet company, a gentle voice that did not demand reply. The crunch of wagon wheels on gravel tore him from thought. He narrowed his eyes toward the rise, where a dust-stained coach crept down the slope, horses etched sharp against the red-streaked sky. His chest gave a sudden thud, not eagerness, but a strange, unwelcome quickening. The wagon halted at his gate. The driver hopped down with a curt nod. "Delivery for Mr. Malcolm Hayes." Malcolm tipped his hat, brim shadowing his face. The door creaked open. Hinges shrieked like a blade through silence. And then she stepped out. Not the bright-faced maiden of 18 he had pictured. Not a girl in light calico with clear eyes untested by sorrow. The woman who climbed down was Miriam Walker, a black widow, shoulders narrow beneath a faded black dress. The cloth was thinned at the elbows, shoes worn flat at the heel. Her sun-browned face carried eyes rimmed raw, not from dust, but from tears already spent. She clutched a scuffed valise to her chest, as though it were the last scrap of a former life. Malcolm froze. His heart tightened. This was no unmarked beginning. Before him stood a weight of grief wrapped in a fragile frame, eyes carved deep with loss. Miriam lifted her gaze. For an instant their eyes locked. What struck him was not beauty, but sorrow. Sorrow so vast it mirrored the darkness in himself. Her voice rose then, trembling, yet steady enough to pierce the wind. "If I am not what you expected, I will go back." No pleading, no excuses, just a single line laying her fate bare in his hands. Malcolm's throat clenched. The scar there throbbed, not with old pain, but with something he could not name. He longed to answer, but sound would not come. Instead, he shifted aside, boots scraping the porch, and pulled open the cabin door. It was answer enough. Miriam lowered her eyes, hugged the valise closer, and climbed the steps. As she passed, the hem of her dress brushed his hand. The faintest touch, hesitant, quivering, stirred something restless inside him. She carried with her the dry scent of dust, tinged faintly with pressed flowers. It lingered as she crossed the threshold, leaving him alone in the fading light. The driver turned his team, wheels kicking up a haze that drifted away over the ridge. The sky deepened into bruised violet. Malcolm stood long at the edge of the porch, staring westward where the sun bled down behind the mountains. He drew a slow breath through his nose, let it slip heavy from his chest, and finally stepped inside, shutting the heavy door. The cabin thickened with silence, yet silence no longer meant emptiness. 2 breaths now filled that space. 1 man, 1 woman. He, relearning what it meant to feel a voice stirring within. She, daring to believe she had a place she need not leave. Deep in his chest, beneath scar tissue and memory, something shifted. Not hope, not yet, but the faint ache of it, like a seed pressing against the soil. That night, Dusty Creek lay still, but in a lone cabin at the valley's edge, a story had begun. Miriam stepped across the threshold as though entering another world. The cabin was small, a single room with a cold hearth, a rough-hewn table, and a few lopsided chairs. The air smelled of old pine and spent ash. Shelves along the wall sagged beneath jars of salt, rusted nails, coils of rope, and a few dog-eared Bibles. The place was stark but not lifeless. It felt like a dwelling where silence had spoken for years, leaving objects to carry the weight of words. Near the door hung a slate board, gray with chalk scratches, water in the barrel, wood behind the porch, a stub of chalk dangled from a cord. Malcolm did not meet her eyes, only tapped the board with a calloused finger, his gesture serving as greeting. Miriam gave a slight nod, clutching her valise as she moved inside. She set it down near the narrow bed against the wall. The blanket was worn but folded neat, the sheets smelling faintly of age. She traced the fabric with her fingertips, sensing the clumsy care Malcolm had taken to prepare it. A sigh slipped from her chest. Malcolm crossed to the table, his boots groaning against the floorboards. He drew a jug of water, set it down, and pulled out a chair. With a small motion of his hand, he beckoned her to sit. Their eyes met for a flicker before he lowered his head, chalk in hand. He scrawled a single word. Drink. She reached for the tin cup, her fingers brushing his. It was only the faintest touch, awkward and unmeant, yet it startled her heart into a painful throb. Since her husband's death, she had grown unused to another's touch. That clumsy graze unsettled her, sent her withdrawing quick. Malcolm's hand curled against the wood, as if he too had felt the jolt, but chose to bury it deep. Neither spoke. Only the wind pressed through the seams of the cabin, howling thin and high like a ghost over the prairie. Miriam drank, cool water soothing her parched throat after the long ride. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the sight of the scar slashing down his neck held her back. His eyes, gray and weary, met hers only in fleeting moments, and in them she glimpsed not hardness, but a question that neither dared form aloud. Later, when she rose to fetch more water from the barrel, Malcolm moved to help. They bent at the same time, elbows brushing. Both startled, lifting their heads. Their gazes caught. Awkward. Bare. Too close. Heat rushed her cheeks before he turned away, carrying the bucket to the table. Without a word, he strode out to the porch, leaving the door half open. She watched him a long moment, his tall frame outlined in fading light, before her thoughts whispered, "Does he want me here? Or is he simply enduring my presence?" That evening he built a fire. Orange glow licked the walls, stretching the shadows of 2 bodies across rough timber. He set a pot above the flames, the scent of dried beef and onions filling the cabin. Miriam sat at the table, folding her worn shawl, her eyes drawn to the restless dance of firelight. She stole glances at him, at his strong shoulders, his sure hands, though his face remained veiled in shadow. Supper was plain. He slid a bowl across the table and chalked 2 words: "Eat this." She nodded, spooning broth to her lips. It was hot, but it warmed more than her stomach. It warmed like the fleeting glance she thought she caught from him, quick as a match strike, gone before she could be sure it had been there at all. Afterward, he cleared the dishes in silence. She listened to the small sounds, the splash of water in the basin, the dull clink of tin. Mundane sounds, but not empty ones. Together they carved a rhythm into the silence, something more than solitude. Night fell hard. Wind clawed the walls, rattling the shutters. Miriam lay on the narrow bed, eyes wide to the dark rafters. The quiet pressed heavy, broken only by her heartbeat. Then came the sounds: Malcolm's slow tread across the boards, the thump of a log added to the fire, the low sigh of flame rising again. Each noise reminded her she was no longer alone. When the fire sank low, the cabin settled into stillness. She turned on her side, pulling the blanket high to her chin. Her eyes stung with old salt, but no tears fell. For the first night in many months, she did not weep. She only listened, the sound of her own breath, and the steady breath of a silent man in the room beyond. That night, silence was different. Not hollow, but full. Not cold, but warm. It carried the weight of 2 souls, one relearning the shape of words, the other relearning the right to stay. Above the roof, wind whistled long and mournful. But inside, 2 shadows lay beneath the same roof, divided by a wall yet bound by the same air. For the first time in years, the cabin held more than one breath. Morning came slow to Dusty Creek, as if even the sun hesitated to rise over such barren ground. Miriam woke to thin shafts of gold slipping through the cracks in the wall. Outside, the steady rhythm of Malcolm's boots moved across the porch, then faded into the fields. She sat at the edge of the bed, fingers tightening around the handle of her worn valise. There was little inside: a few threadbare dresses, a weathered Bible, and some letters with no return address. Yet what she carried weighed heavier than all of it: her past. They called her the Black Widow. The name was not of her choosing. It was pinned to her by whispers and stares, and it clung like shadow. It followed her from town to town, across wagons and trains, poisoning every glance cast her way. A single name had the power to strangle a life. Her first husband, Thomas Green, had been a horse trader in Kansas, broad-shouldered, generous at first. But after a few winters, his true nature surfaced: hot-tempered, heavy-fisted. Drunken nights brought shouts, the slam of fists against tables, sometimes against her. Miriam learned silence, knowing a single word might spark worse fire. One afternoon, Thomas was thrown from a stallion too wild to tame. His skull struck stone, his neck snapped. They called it accident. But at the graveside, Miriam heard the mutters. She cursed him. She brought it on. She did not weep. Her tears had frozen deep inside, a block of ice no warmth could melt. Her second husband, Daniel Ward, was different. A veteran, gentle and steady. Miriam married him not from love, but from longing for peace, for a home free of rage. Daniel's smile was soft, his rough hands kind. For the first time she slept without fear. But fate did not spare her. On a trading trip near Topeka, Daniel was ambushed. His body was found by the roadside, blood soaking the dust. The law called it bandits. His family called it something else. She brings death. She carries doom. And from then on, the name Black Widow stalked her every step. Miriam carried those memories like scars that would not heal. She wished, at times, she could abandon them along the road. But they clung tight, surfacing in every hushed voice behind her back, every cold stare in every town. Slowly, she came to believe her life was a suspended sentence, one without pardon. She sighed, lifting her Bible from the valise. Its pages had yellowed, some blurred by old tears. Pressing it to her chest, she sat long in silence. Outside, hooves struck the dry ground, a hollow rhythm against the land. By dusk, Malcolm returned. His shirt was dark with sweat, dust clinging to his sleeves. He did not meet her eyes. At the table, he washed his hands, then scrawled on the slate. Wood behind porch needs stacking. The letters were straight and hard, like the man himself. Miriam nodded and followed. Together they stacked the logs. At times their hands brushed against the same piece. Each touch made her startle, heart fluttering sharp, while Malcolm's hand pulled back, silence pressing down like a wound unspoken. That night, when Miriam stepped toward her small room, she found a bowl of soup waiting on the floor by the door. Steam rose in soft spirals carrying the scent of beef and onions. No knock, no note, no word, just the soup set down like an unseen hand reaching out. She knelt, cupping the bowl with both hands. The heat seeped into her skin, chasing off the cold lodged in her chest. Biting her lip, she let the tears come. For the first time in months, she cried, not from shame or fear, but from the weight of unexpected kindness. Her voice trembled into the empty room, no louder than a breath. Maybe I am not always a shadow. In the other room, Malcolm sat alone before the hearth, his gray eyes fixed on the flame, now low and fading. He heard the muffled sound, like someone weeping quietly. He did not knock. He wrote nothing. He simply sat, letting silence hold them both. For him, it was enough to remain. That night, Miriam ate every drop of the soup. When she set the empty bowl back in the hall, she lingered, half hoping he might appear. But only the faint outline of his shadow stretched across the floorboards, steady and near, no longer a stranger. In the darkness, Miriam knew this cabin was not yet a home, but at least it had not cast her out. And that, for her, was more than any place had ever given. That afternoon, the sky shifted so fast, it chilled Miriam's bones. From the west, black clouds rolled like a herd of beasts, swallowing the last light of day. The air thickened, pressing down as if an unseen hand weighed heavy on the valley. Birds fell silent. Only the wind cut across the dry grass, sharp and merciless, carrying warning. Malcolm stood on the porch, gaze fixed on the violet horizon. He drew in a long breath. 6 years of solitude had taught him the language of weather, the scent of rain before it fell, the feel of pressure tightening in the lungs. But this storm was different. It carried the bite of iron, the sting of lightning. He moved quick along the porch, lashing shutters, then motioned sharply toward the cabin, telling Miriam without words to stay inside. But the horses had already broken into panic. From the stable came frantic shrieks, the pounding of hooves against timber. Lantern in hand, Malcolm plunged into the dark. Thunder cracked overhead, white fire splitting the sky into jagged wounds. Inside, chaos reigned. A young colt reared, foam slicking its mane, eyes rolling white. Another tore free of its rope, hooves slamming the walls till the boards shuddered. Malcolm spread his arms, muscles straining, trying to hold the wildness back. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Where once his voice would have steadied them, there was only silence. His gestures brought no calm, only drove the fear deeper. Miriam could not sit idle. When the wind ripped the door wide, she gathered her shawl and ran into the storm. Rain slashed her face, soaked her dress. She spotted the swing of the lantern and hurled herself toward the stable. "Malcolm!" she cried, but the gale stole her voice. He turned only for a heartbeat, eyes flashing with helpless fury. And in that instant, Miriam understood. The horses did not need force. They needed a sound, something steady, something to cling to in the roar. All her life she had lived in whispers, cradled by her mother's songs through endless nights. There was only one thing left to do. She let the shawl fall, stepped into the chaos. Among thunderclaps and hooves hammering wood, her lips trembled open. A hymn slipped out. At first it was fragile, barely more than breath. Rock of Ages, cleft for me. The notes wove into the storm, quaking like a willow in the wind. But they did not falter. They grew, clear and sure, like a flame finding its path in darkness. The sound washed through the stable. The colt's ears pricked forward, its hooves falling still. Another horse backed away, snorting, but no longer striking. An old mare stretched her neck toward the voice, ribs shuddering as her breath calmed. The hymn wrapped around them, binding panic with invisible thread. Malcolm froze. His scarred hands dropped. His chest heaved, lantern light flickering across his face. And there she was, Miriam, shining in the flashes of lightning. Rain streamed through her curls, plastering them to tessu. Her thin shoulders. Her dress clung to her body, heavy and soaked, but her voice did not waver. It rose above the storm, steady as prayer. Thunder roared, but it could not drown her. In that stable her song filled every hollow, carried to every trembling heart. It reached Malcolm too, piercing the silence he had carried for 6 long years. And for the first time in all those years, he wept. Not the loud cry of a broken man, but tears that mingled with rain, falling quiet and unstoppable. 6 winters of loneliness, the memory of the bullet, the ache of a throat locked silent. Everything broke open as he looked at her. Miriam, drenched and unyielding, stood like a flame he thought had long gone out. The hymn ended. Silence fell deep as a canyon. The horses breathed slow, the storm's fury muffled to rain on the roof. Miriam opened her eyes and met his gaze. Lightning laid bare his face, wet with rain, lined with tears. They stared until time itself seemed to pause. No storm, no stable, only 2 souls scarred and searching, seeing each other through a fragile light. Malcolm turned aside, hand swiping across his cheek, though it hid nothing. His knees buckled. He braced against the wall, chest rising and falling in ragged waves. Miriam stepped closer. Gently, she laid her hand on his soaked arm. That simple touch pierced past scar and silence, reaching a place in him he thought long dead. Outside, the storm howled on, but inside the stable, another storm had broken and passed, the storm within them both. Market day in Dusty Creek was always a clamor of noise. wagon wheels grinding on dirt, hens squawking in baskets, men calling back and forth as they bartered. Yet to Miriam, every sound thudded into her chest like her own quickened heartbeat. It was the first time she had stepped into town since coming to Malcolm's ranch. She pulled her shawl tight and lowered her gaze as she entered the general store. In her basket lay only a few coins Malcolm had given her, and a slip of paper scrawled with what they needed: flour, salt, nails, rope. The handwriting was sharp, rough, like strokes cut with a knife. Malcolm's hand. At first, it seemed ordinary enough. The shopkeeper glanced at her, then turned back to weighing sugar and tying paper bundles. But soon Miriam felt the shift, the sting of eyes on her back. From the corner of the room, between the shelves, through the window glass, glances pricked at her like hidden needles. A woman's whisper slid through the air, sharp enough to reach her ear. There. That's her. Came out of Kansas. Another voice followed, harsher. 2 husbands, both dead. Folks call her the Black Widow. Miriam's fingers faltered as she counted coins. Her chest tightened. The coins slipped, clattering loud on the counter, rolling across wood. A small sound, yet to her it crashed like thunder. She bent quickly to gather them, but the murmurs only thickened. Brings death where she goes. No woman leaves 2 graves behind without curse or blame. Heat flared in Miriam's face. The shopkeeper said nothing, only tied her parcels faster. But all around, the eyes cut at her with open contempt. Hugging her basket to her chest, she hurried for the door, desperate to escape the invisible blades. On the street, a knot of children played near the blacksmith's shop. As she passed, something sharp flew through the air. A stone, jagged-edged, struck her side hard. She stumbled, pain ripping through her ribs, breath knocked short. Behind her came laughter, shrill, childish, or perhaps an older hand hiding among them. She could not tell. The basket weighed like iron in her grip. Miriam straightened her spine, clutching the handle until her knuckles burned. She would not cry. Not here. Not before them. And then a shadow fell across the street. Malcolm Hayes. He stood there, tall, broad, his frame dark against the glare of noon sun. Dust clung to his coat, the brim of his hat veiling half his face. No one had seen him arrive, but his presence froze the air. Miriam turned, eyes meeting his. There was no pity there. Pity was what she dreaded most. What she found instead was steadiness, like a post driven deep in the storm. Malcolm strode forward. He spoke no words. He could not. He only lifted a hand, and a boy nearby thrust him the small signboard that stood before the store. Taking chalk from his pocket, he pressed it hard to the wood. The screech of chalk cut sharp in the hush. Each stroke was bold, certain. The townsfolk craned closer, muttering, uneasy. Then Malcolm raised the board high. Enough. One word. Tall, straight, carved in white across the board. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. No whispers, no smirks. Only the wind, threading through the narrow street. Malcolm set the board at Miriam's feet, then straightened. His eyes swept the crowd, lingering on face after face. No threat passed his lips, but his gaze alone was weight enough. Shoulders slumped, eyes fell, a few turned away. Miriam stood frozen. Her fingers bit into the basket handle. She had no words, but when her eyes rose to his, she found something she had never expected. Not pity, not sorrow, protection. In the heart of the square, before every watching eye, Miriam felt for the first time that she was not wholly alone. Someone had stood beside her, silent yet firm, answering the voices with a single word stronger than 100 rumors. The wind tugged at Malcolm's coat. He tipped his head, motioning her forward. Miriam swallowed hard, then nodded. Together they walked on, side by side. No one blocked their path. Each footstep over the red dust rang like an oath. No one would break her with whispers again. Far down the road, Miriam dared to glance at him. He did not return the look. His stride was steady, his rough hands swinging at his sides. Yet in his quiet presence, she felt something she had never known before. Safety. That night, Miriam sat alone in her room, arms wrapped around the basket she had carried home. The whispers still echoed in her mind, but they no longer crushed her. Instead, she saw Malcolm again in her thoughts, his hand gripping the chalk, his gray eyes burning over the crowd, that single word standing taller than their scorn. Her fingers touched the spot on her side where the stone had struck. It still ached, but beneath the pain was something new. Not yet hope, not quite. But the first fragile sense of being defended, of being seen as more than a cursed name. She closed her eyes, letting the tears come. This time they were not bitter. They tasted sweet, born of understanding. Outside, the wind still swept Dusty Creek, but within the cabin, a wall invisible yet strong had risen. One word, enough, etched into the memory of a town and into the heart of a woman long called the Black Widow. That night, Dusty Creek lay hushed as if the land itself had died. The moon hid behind gray banks of cloud, leaving the prairie draped in a sickly blue shadow. Only the rasp of crickets and the low murmur of wind through the willows broke the stillness. Miriam sat long in her room, the basket from town forgotten in the corner, her eyes vacant. The whispers of the marketplace still sliced at her. Black Widow, curse, omen. Each word clawed fresh at scars too old to bleed. She would not let Malcolm see her tears. He had stood for her in front of them all, one written word silencing an entire town. Yet shame still clung to her like mud, the sense that she was only trouble in his quiet life. When the night deepened, Miriam wrapped a thin shawl and slipped outside. She followed the worn path down to the stable. The smell of hay, damp earth, and the steady warmth of horses wrapped around her. In the dimness, she sank to the floor, back against the timber wall, face buried in her palms. At last, the tears broke loose, hot and bitter against her calloused hands. The stable door creaked. Miriam startled, looking up. Malcolm stepped inside, his tall frame cut dark against the glow of the oil lamp he carried. He asked no questions, showed no surprise. He set the lamp on a shelf, then lowered himself beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. Heat from his body seeped through, easing the chill lodged in her chest. From his belt he drew a small knife. Leaning forward, he pressed the blade to the wood. The scrape of steel against plank filled the air, slow and deliberate. Miriam blinked through her tears, watching. When he pulled back, 4 words stood carved deep, rough yet unyielding. You don't deserve shame. Her hand trembled as she touched the fresh grooves, splinters still clinging. The letters blurred as more tears spilled. She turned to him. His gray eyes did not hide or look away. They held hers steady, as if to say he saw it all. The pain, but also the strength she still carried. Shaking, Miriam lifted her hand to his mouth. Her fingers traced the hard ridges of scar, yet beneath them his breath burned warm. Her voice broke to a whisper. "If you cannot speak, then I will sing for you." Malcolm closed his eyes, not to retreat, but to open. His broad shoulders shuddered once, and then he leaned into her touch, letting her hand rest against his lips. And in that moment, the walls between them fell. Miriam folded against him, and Malcolm's arms went round her. Awkward, trembling, yet tight, as if he feared she might vanish. In the scent of hay and the wavering gold of the lamp, they reached for each other. No vows, no sweet words, only ragged breath, pounding hearts, and the desperate truth of touch. Her dress wrinkled beneath his searching hands, clumsy and unsure but honest. They trembled, shy and raw, like two souls relearning what it meant to be touched without pain. Rain began to patter on the stable roof, steady as a drum. Inside, desire long, suppressed, flared bright. Their embrace tightened. Their breaths mingled hot against damp skin. Every kiss, every caress carried both fear and courage, the courage to live again. When at last the storm within them eased, Miriam lay curled against Malcolm's chest, her breath softening, her heartbeat falling in rhythm with his. The lamp guttered low, its glow brushing the carved words in the timber. 4 letters of truth, standing as witness to a night without promises, yet wholly real. Malcolm pulled a thin blanket over her shoulders. He could not speak, but his rough hand slid gently through her sweat-damp curls. Miriam closed her eyes, whispering faintly, "For the first time, I do not feel ashamed to cry." He gave no reply, only lowered his brow to hers. In that thick silence they saw each other plain, not through rumor, not through judgment, but as 2 scarred souls who chose to stay. That night, in the stable, with the smell of hay and salt of tears, with scar and touch, Malcolm and Miriam gave all they had left. Not promises of forever, but the bare truth. They were no longer alone. Rumors in Dusty Creek never died. They only changed shape, swelling like flames when the wind caught them. After the day Malcolm carved the word enough, no one dared openly spit insults at Miriam. Yet in the shadows, stories spread, how she had dragged a curse from Kansas, how her husbands had died unjustly, how she had come to Dusty Creek to seduce a mute man and steal his land. And as always, rumor found men willing to use it. One morning, before the sun climbed the ridge, dust rose thick before the cabin. Miriam was sweeping the yard when the thunder of hooves closed in. Her heart lurched as 6 riders drew up, the cloud around them billowing like smoke. At their head sat Harold Granger, brother to her second husband, Daniel Ward. He wore a black coat with its collar high, his face broad and red with drink and pride. Flanking him were 2 lawyers, their crumpled suits stuffed with papers. And behind, astride a dark horse, rode a hired gunman. His black hat brim shadowed his eyes, his coat long and dusty, his pale hand hovering just above the grip of his revolver. The townsfolk streamed behind as if to watch a show. They muttered, craned their necks, eager for scandal, hungry for blood. Miriam stepped back, hand clutching her dress. Her throat went dry. Old fears clawed up, judging stares, whispers of black widow, the graves of 2 husbands. The cabin door opened. Malcolm Hayes stepped out. His frame filled the porch, tall and unyielding, He spoke no word, yet silence fell heavy for a moment. His eyes locked on Harold, cold and sharp as steel. Harold cleared his throat and strode forward, voice booming. "We've come for justice. This woman—" He thrust a finger at Miriam, words dripping venom. "Deceived my brother Daniel. He died before he knew her treachery. Now she's here, chaining herself to a mute fool for his land and home. She must be taken back to face the truth." The crowd rippled, some nodding, some frowning. Miriam froze. She wanted to cry out that Daniel had fallen to bandits, that she had deceived no one. But her voice caught, strangled by fear. Malcolm stepped down from the porch. He placed himself square between her and Harold. His hand rested on the butt of his gun, calm, deliberate. The gray in his eyes flared with fire. Not the blaze of rage, but the steady burn of resolve. The hired gunman's lips curved in a thin blade of a smile. His fingers brushed the grip of his revolver, eager. The lawyers flapped their papers high, shouting, "Here's proof!" Proof she married for property, then ran. Miriam trembled as every eye bore down on her, cold and merciless. She stepped back until her shoulder pressed against Malcolm's back. He did not move, only tilted his head slightly, a signal clear as words. "Stay. I am here." Harold barked again, feeding the fire. "You think you can hide beneath the shadow of a mute man, widow? Number. You'll come with us. The law will judge you." Waz swelled, the crowds murmur, the restless stamping of horses, the scrape of boots shifting. Tension coiled, taut as a drawn bowstring. Malcolm did not flinch. He advanced one step closer to Harold, closing the distance to a few strides. His hand gripped the gunstock firm. His face held no change, but his eyes struck like knives. Wind gusted through, whipping dust into a veil. Miriam saw it then. Two sides locked. Men twisting justice into a weapon, and Malcolm's lone figure, wordless yet unbending, standing as the wall between her and ruin. Her heart pounded. Fear still clung, but threaded through it was something else, something fierce and startling, the feeling of being shielded. The crowd held its breath. The standoff hovered on a knife's edge. Malcolm wrote no words, raised no board this time. His language was the set of his shoulders, the weight of his silence, the readiness in his hand. One wrong twitch, and blood would soak the dust. From behind him, Miriam's eyes blurred with tears. 6 years he had lived in silence, yet now that silence was no weakness. It was weapon, and it bent the will of those before him. Harold narrowed his gaze, voice dropping low, heavy with threat. "You sure you want to stand against the law, Hayes? You've no tongue, but bullets don't need speech." Malcolm's eyes did not waver. He drew his revolver slow, deliberate, lowering the barrel toward the ground. The click of steel rang sharp in the tense air. A few in the crowd flinched back, instinct pulling them away. Miriam drew a deep breath, her fists clenched at her sides. For the first time she felt the past loosen its hold. She was no longer chained to it alone, because here, before her, stood a man willing to face death itself to keep her from falling again. And in that charged silence, alive with fire, a new chapter was about to begin. The first sound was not words, but the crack of metal splitting the still morning air. Gunfire. Everything shattered at once. Powder smoke curled thick, dust rose in choking clouds, Harold Granger's horse screamed, rearing high. In the flash of it, Malcolm Hayes staggered, his hand still locked on the grip of his revolver. Blood bloomed scarlet across his shirt, and his great frame crashed to the porch boards with a heavy thud. Miriam cried out, but her voice drowned in chaos. The crowd broke apart, some running, some ducking behind crates, others frozen in place. Dust, horses, and terror swirled into a storm. Malcolm lay on his side, breath ragged, blood spilling fast from the wound in his ribs. His eyes stayed open, searching, straining, until they found Miriam. In their gray depths burned pain, but also a plea, fierce and wordless. She tried to reach him, but a horse, crazed with fear, bolted through the crowd. Its hooves struck the dirt like hammers, scattering people in shrieks. And then Miriam saw a small boy, no more than 6, sprawled in the street. His eyes went wide, frozen as the beast thundered toward him, hooves raised to crush him flat. There was no time for thought, no room for fear. Miriam ran, her shawl flew from her shoulders, her shoes slipped on the grit. She hurled herself forward, flinging her basket aside, throwing her own body over the child. The impact jarred her bones. She gathered the boy tight, rolling him clear of the street just as the horse crashed past. A hoof grazed her shoulder with a sickening crack. Pain burst white. Blood soaked her dress where fabric tore. She hit the ground hard, vision blurring. But the boy lived. A stunned silence swept through. Then a mother's scream, high and broken. She saved him! Dear God, she saved my boy. The crowd surged forward. The woman snatched her son into her arms, clutching him with trembling hands. Eyes wide at Miriam, fear and gratitude colliding. Voices rose, wavering, uncertain. She pushed him clear! I saw it. She took the blow herself. Lord above, she spared the child. Miriam forced herself upright, clutching her bleeding shoulder. The agony spun her head, but her gaze fixed not on the crowd, not on the gunman, but on the porch, where Malcolm lay. He still breathed. Shallow, heavy, but alive. When her eyes found his, he moved his head the smallest fraction, a nod no one else might notice. And in his gaze, through the haze of pain, a fire burned, not for himself, but for her. To tell her he was not gone yet. Harold Granger stumbled back, his face mottled red with rage and panic. The hired gun, the one who had pulled the trigger, was seized by townsmen, forced down, his weapon ripped away. Shouts flew, anger turning against him. Men stepped forward, interposing themselves between Harold and the bleeding woman he had condemned. Doubt rippled through the gathering. Miriam's blood pattered down, dark stains blooming in the dust, but she felt none of it, only the pounding of her heart. The sight of Malcolm fallen. She staggered toward him, each step fire beneath her feet. The crowd parted, hushed. No mocking now, no whispering slurs, only silence heavy as judgment and eyes wide with something close to awe. The Black Widow, they had called her. Yet here she stood, drenched in her own blood, having thrown herself in front of death for a stranger's child. Miriam sank beside Malcolm, her hands slick and trembling pressed against the wound at his side. He flinched, but did not push her away. His breath shuddered, warm against her wrist. "Don't you leave me," she whispered, voice breaking, tears mixing with the dust on his shirt. His hand rose, weak but steady, brushing her cheek. That touch said what his voice could not. "I am still here. For you." Behind them, voices rose again, but different now. "She is no curse." She saved a child before my very eyes. She gave her blood for one not her own. Heads nodded, eyes softened. The tide turned. No longer daggers of suspicion, their stares shifted to uncertainty, then respect. Harold stood pale, his words strangled in his throat. No one heeded him anymore. The wind swept through, stirring red dust, carrying the stench of blood and powder. On the porch lay two figures, a silent man and a woman once condemned, bound together in pain and defiance. For the first time, Dusty Creek saw truth clear. This was not the Black Widow of rumor. This was a woman of flesh and spirit, who had risked everything for life. The whispers stilled. Silence itself bore witness. Miriam bowed over Malcolm, pressing his hand against her face, her own voice a broken vow. I am here. We will endure this. Together and in that dust-choked morning, with gun smoke still hanging in the air, something shifted, not only in two battered souls, but in the eyes of a whole town. The air hung thick with the stench of gunpowder, blood, and red dust. On the porch boards, Malcolm Hayes lay on his side, breath ragged, his shirt soaked dark where blood spilled from his ribs. It ran in thin streams across the planks, dripping into the dirt below, spreading crimson into the dust. Miriam knelt beside him, her hands slick with blood as she pressed hard to stem the flow, her tear-filled eyes locked on his paling face. The crowd stood hushed. Only the heaving of frightened horses and the whistle of wind stirring dust broke the silence. Harold Granger stood rooted in the yard, his bluster drained, the fight gone from his eyes. His grand scheme, to drag Miriam into daylight and condemn her before the town, lay in ruins. For they had all seen her fling herself into danger, saving a child with no thought for herself. Miriam bent low, her voice breaking. Don't leave me. Please don't leave me. Malcolm's eyes opened. Clouded with pain, yet steady, they clung to her. For 6 long years, silence had been his prison. Since the day a bullet tore through his throat, he had lived shackled by the wound, bound in shame. He had never once tried to force words, never once dared. But now, staring at Miriam trembling in blood and tears, he knew silence was no longer enough. A heavy breath shuddered through him. Fire scorched his throat, raw and tearing, but he willed sound to rise. His lips cracked open. A voice, hoarse and broken, scraped free. My! Miriam's head snapped up, her heart seizing. The crowd shifted, gasps breaking, bodies leaning closer to hear. Malcolm swallowed, cords straining at his neck. A second sound cracked loose, rough but clearer. Wife! A ripple surged through the gathering. Faces that once carried scorn now stared, stunned. He shut his eyes, forcing again, dragging words like stone from a well. His lips trembled, but the syllables came. Is good. Silence fell heavy, absolute. 6 years. 6 years without a voice. 6 years of chalk-scratched boards, curt gestures, and the heavy chain of silence. And now, with blood darkening his shirt, Malcolm Hayes had spoken 4 words. 4 words that shattered rumor. 4 words strong enough to lift Miriam from the pit of shame. Miriam broke. A sob tore free as she fell over him, arms clutching, tears spilling hot down her cheeks. You spoke. My God, you spoke. He had no strength left, but his hand, bloodied and trembling, curled weakly around hers. From the crowd, A voice whispered, "He called her his wife, and said she was good." Another answered, firmer, "From Hayes himself." No more doubt, the whispers shifted, the tide turning. Where once they condemned, now they murmured in awe. The crowd swelled with uneasy quiet, the weight of judgment crumbling. Harold Granger flushed red, eyes darting, jaw clamped. His lawyers fumbled, stuffing their papers away. The hired gun, pinned by angry townsmen, sagged in. Defeat. At last, Harold spat a curse, wheeled his horse and barked, "Enough! We're done here." Hooves thundered away, carrying their broken cause with them. What they had called justice lay dead, undone by 4 frail words. Miriam still knelt, her whole body trembling with fear and release. She brushed damp hair from Malcolm's brow, pressed her face to his chest, listening desperately for the beat within. It was there, faint but steady. The crowd began to disperse, their steps slow, their eyes lingering. No longer did they cast knives of scorn. Some looked back with wonder, some with respect. When the yard was nearly empty, dust and wind their only witnesses, Miriam exhaled in a shudder, tears still falling. Her hand cupped Malcolm's face, her voice breaking but fierce. "You've given me more than anyone ever has. You spoke for me, and I swear I will not let you go." Malcolm's eyes, heavy with pain, flickered open. At the edge of his mouth, faint but true, curved the first smile she had ever seen on him. She clutched his hand tight, then turned, calling toward the cabin, voice hoarse but resolute. "Help me! Bring bandages. Bring clean water. He must live." From the edge of the dispersing crowd, a few townsfolk stopped. A woman who once had sneered at Miriam in the market stepped forward, bowing her head. "We'll help." Miriam nodded, tears still falling, but now they carried light. That night, when they carried Malcolm into the cabin and laid him on his pied, Miriam never left his side. Her hand stayed locked in his. Her voice rose soft in song, quivering but sure, filling the silence that had ruled his life. And both of them knew. Those 4 words, "My wife is good," had not only freed Miriam from the town's cruel tongue, they had broken open the prison of silence that had held Malcolm for 6 long years. The small cabin on the hill, once so accustomed to silence, now carried different sounds. The bubbling of boiling water in a pot of medicine, the steady stirring of a spoon in a bowl of soup, and the soft hum of Miriam Walker's voice as she sat by the sickbed. The air was heavy with the scent of bitter herbs, the smoke of burning wood, and the copper tang of blood that seeped through the bandages she changed again and again. Malcolm Hayes lay unmoving for days. The wound in his side burned him with fever, his breath sometimes frantic, sometimes faint as a whisper. That first night, Miriam sat through every hour, pressing cold cloths to his forehead, clutching his hand as if to tether him to this earth. She heard him groan in delirium, broken sounds trapped in his ruined throat. Each time she bent close and whispered, "You're still here. I will not let you go." Day after day, Miriam became the heartbeat of the cabin. She brewed medicine from roots she bought in town, cooked thin broths he could swallow, wiped away the sweat, washed every bloodied cloth. Small tasks, repeated endlessly, but carried with the weight of her whole being, poured into keeping him alive. At night, when the fever raged, she sang. Old lullabies her mother once crooned when she was a child, fragile threads of melody she cast to tether his soul to life. At first her voice trembled, but slowly it grew steadier, filled with love she had never dared to speak. Her song filled the emptiness, a language to replace the one his body had lost. Sometimes Malcolm surfaced between fevered dreams. He opened his eyes to see her slumped at the bedside, her hand still locked in his even as she slept. Stray curls spilled loose around her face, her cheek pressed against the wooden frame, leaving a red mark. He wanted to lift a hand to touch her, but strength failed him. Instead, he closed his eyes again, choosing to rest in the comfort of her presence. For the first time in years, the cabin was not cold. Miriam changed the space itself. She dusted away years of neglect, rehung curtains, stacked wood neatly under the eaves. The kitchen filled with the warmth of chicken broth, the sweet scent of cornbread baking, driving out the iron smell of blood. What had been only silence and memory now breathed with fragile life. One afternoon, as she changed his bandages, Malcolm motioned for a knife and a block of wood. She froze, fearing some rash impulse, but the steel in his eyes persuaded her. His hand shook, but he carved, slow and steady. The scrape of blade against grain echoed, thin curls of wood falling across the blanket. When at last he handed her the block, Miriam's breath caught. "I'm proud of you." 4 rough words, jagged but deep. She traced the grooves with her fingertip, as though touching his heart itself. Tears welled and fell, darkening the wood. Without thought, she lifted his scarred hand to her lips and kissed it, trembling, sure. Malcolm's gray eyes softened, the townsfolk, ice within them melted into gentleness. He could not speak, but he gripped her hand tight, sending his truth without sound. "You've brought me back." From that day he fought harder. He practiced sitting upright with her help, shuffling a few steps across the room, swallowing spoonfuls of soup she fed him. Each tiny victory Miriam marked with her presence, her steady gaze, her unfailing hand. The cabin learned new sounds, the creak of wood as he walked, the clink of spoon against bowl, and rare bursts of laughter, faint but real. One morning, Miriam threw open the window, letting sunlight flood the bed. Malcolm turned his head, his eyes finding her. He didn't write, didn't carve. He simply lifted his hand and placed it against her cheek. The gesture broke her. Tears streamed down as she pressed her own hand over his, holding it there, smiling through the sobs. In that moment, no words were needed. Their gaze carried what speech could not. That love was not a promise of forever, but the daily act of surviving together, of small gestures and steadfast presence. And the cabin on the hill, after so many years drowned in silence, finally breathed again. The long days passed slowly, and the cabin on the hill was no longer a place of cold silence. The air still carried the smell of bitter medicine and wood smoke, but now it was the scent of life, of a woman who kept vigil through the night, and of a man clawing his way back from the edge of death. Miriam Walker sat by the bed, holding the worn Bible she had found on the shelf. Its cover was frayed, its pages yellowed, but the words were still clear. She turned them one by one, her voice soft as prairie wind as she read aloud. Each verse was more than prayer. It was warmth, etched into Malcolm's heart, like a promise that silence was not his fate. Malcolm leaned against the pillow, gray eyes steady on her. For 6 years, no one had read beside him. For 6 years, there had been only the wind, the horses, and solitude. Yet now, within each syllable she spoke, His heartbeat slowed, and the trembling in his hands stilled. When she closed the book and lifted her gaze, the candlelight flickered over her face, casting it in gentleness. One hand rested atop the Bible as she whispered, "Malcolm, call my name." He froze. The request was simple, but for him it was a cliff's edge. 6 years ago, when the bullet tore through his throat, he had sealed that door shut. Since then, he had never tried to call anyone's name, not even in dreams. Miriam did not look away. Her eyes were earnest, but not pressing. She knew she was asking for a battle, but she believed they had weathered enough pain to take this step together. Malcolm swallowed hard. His throat burned raw, dry as desert stone. He parted his lips, but the first sound was nothing more than a broken breath. His body tensed, fist knotting the blanket. Miriam caught his hand instantly, whispering, "I'm here. You're not alone." He closed his eyes, drew in a long breath. Then, slowly, painfully, the sound broke free, hoarse, fractured, but stronger than before. The first syllable flickered like a spark in the wind. Miriam leaned close, shaping the word with her lips for him to see. Miriam. His gaze fixed on her mouth. He tried again, and this time the sound came, awkward but alive. Miriam. The room seemed to burst open. Tears streamed down Miriam's face. She broke, clutching his hand to her chest. One word, but it was everything. Her name, carried on his lips, from the man she thought might never call anyone's name again. Malcolm sagged with exhaustion, but in his clouded gray eyes shone a joy he had never known. A faint smile tugged his lips. He had done it. More than that, he had spoken the most important thing, her true name, not a rumor, not a curse. Miriam bent low, pressing her lips to his hand, large, calloused, trembling with weakness. The kiss was slow, tender, a vow beyond words. Malcolm closed his eyes and let it sink deep. After 6 years of silence, he understood. Love did not need many words. It needed only a name, a gaze, a touch in that small room. The candlelight threw their shadows across the wooden walls, flickering proof of a truth. At last, without explanation, without defense, they belonged to each other. Outside, the wind swept gently over the prairie, carrying with it the beginning of a new song. Evening fell slowly over the dusty creek prairie. The sky spilled with streaks of violet, gold, and amber, blending like brushstrokes on a vast oil canvas stretched to the horizon. The last light washed over the land, turning the dry fields into a sea of fire. Crickets began their steady song, the opening hymn of night. On the cabin porch, Malcolm Hayes leaned back against a timber post, his shoulders still wrapped in bandages, though his frame had grown stronger. Beside him sat Miriam Walker, simple dress, curls falling loose after a long day's labor. Between them, warmth pulsed through their interlaced hands, quiet, steady, undeniable. They had come through the storm. Malcolm's wound was healing, but the deeper wound, the 6 years of silence, had begun to crack open through small moments. The word enough scrawled before the town, the day he spoke her name, the faint smile that had crept across his lips. As for Miriam, she no longer lowered her head when she stepped outside. Since the day she threw herself before the hooves to save a child, Dusty Creek had stopped looking at her with scorn. The whispers of Black Widow had died out, replaced first by caution, then by respect. Yet what mattered more than the town's regard was that she no longer needed it. For beside her stood a man who had chosen her, against all odds, against every rumor. The prairie evening held a sacred hush. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. Words had never bound them. It was the nights spent tending wounds, the lullabies sung in the dark, the small, steady gestures that had built their love. Miriam rested her head on Malcolm's shoulder. From there, she heard his heartbeat, slow, firm, a living rhythm she had fought to keep. Gratitude welled in her chest, not for fate but for their shared courage, the courage not to give up when walking away would have been far easier. Malcolm tilted his head, his forehead brushing her hair. In his pale gray eyes, the sunset burned like hidden flame. He tightened his hand over hers, large, calloused, enveloping, as if to say, "I choose to remain." The wind carried the scent of dry grass and baked earth. In the distance, the horses ambled back to the corral, their silhouettes stretching long against the crimson sky. Life went on, storms, slander, and all, and in that quiet rhythm of persistence they had found each other. Miriam closed her eyes and whispered, breath soft, "We don't need promises." Malcolm gave no reply. He didn't need to. The slow nod, the steady squeeze of his hand, were vows enough. They sat watching the last light retreat from the fields, giving way to the cool touch of night. Stars broke open above, thousands scattering across the black sky like a jeweled blanket laid over the prairie. Miriam lifted her gaze, smiling faintly. Here was the peace she had never believed possible. A porch, a man, and a silence that was no longer empty. With his good hand, Malcolm reached into his pocket and drew out a pshon, small piece of wood. The carving he had made still marked its surface. "I'm proud of you." He placed it in her palm. Miriam clutched it, pressed it to her chest, and tears rose. This time not of shame, but of joy. She turned, kissed the back of his hand, a gesture born in days of despair, now a sacred ritual between them. Malcolm watched her, the faint smile returning, his eyes alight with life. The prairie wind stiffened, stirring the leaves, yet on the porch, they did not move. The world spun on, but all they needed to know was this. They had chosen each other, not in grand moments, but in the quiet, everyday choice to stay. As darkness thickened, Miriam leaned closer, her breath mingling with his. She felt her heart sink to the rhythm of his, and in that moment, she understood. True love was not built on radiant vows, but on the daily decision to remain, to trust, to love. Even when the world turns its back, Malcolm bent and kissed her hair. He spoke no words, but in his eyes Miriam saw the three she didn't need to hear. "I love you." Beneath the wide night sky on the humble wooden porch, they sat side by side, silent, yet never alone again. Perhaps their story did not end with grand vows or wedding bells, but with a simple evening, two souls who had endured the storm, sitting together, quietly at peace. At this age, one learns love needs no lofty promises. It survives on daily choices, on holding hands, on facing the same horizon, on staying. Love is like this, silent yet steadfast, humble yet enduring. And perhaps you listening have known loss, have borne unfair names, have been misunderstood. But like Miriam, tenderness and resilience can change how the world looks at you. And like Malcolm, even after years of silence, a single word spoken at the right moment can redeem not only the one you love, but yourself. When age comes, what remains is not how many promises were made, but who sat beside you at dusk. If someone chose to stay, then it was enough for a lifetime. If this story has touched your heart, we invite you to share your thoughts below. Tell us, what do you believe true love is built upon? A look, an embrace, or simply the constancy of being there? If you found warmth in this tale, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so we may continue to bring you more Wild West love stories. Reminders that even on the harshest soil, love can take root. Thank you for journeying with us to the end. May your evening be peaceful, your heart at rest, like the blazing sunset over Dusty Creek, where Malcolm and Miriam chose to remain forever.